Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another CEBRI Online, Brazilian Center for International Relations. My name is Julia Dias Leite. I'm the CEO of CEBRI, and it's a great honor to have here with us Lord Browne. Welcome, Lord Browne, to our debate today, the conversation about the oil industry. And I welcome also the members of our board, Winston, Fritsch, and Jorge Camargo, Vice President of CEBRI, and Décio, Oddone, also a member of CEBRI, for the discussion today about the oil industry. So I'll pass to Winston, who will conduct the debate, and then I'll come back with all of you for questions to the public. Please.
Thank you very much, Julia, and good morning to all of you. Now, introducing Lord Browne is a pleasure, not only because I admire him, but especially because John's life is a nice tale to tell. It's the tale of a young boy in Cambridge, living happily, studying physics in the 60s, in the roaring 60s in Cambridge, who wanted to be a scientist. It was just natural to be a scientist, being near the Cavendish at that time. But he had a practical father who wanted him to be a practical man. So perhaps to please his father, John took a job in a very respected company, an old lady, a relic of the British Empire, who by the time had a logo more like that of a third division British League football club. And there he went for what promised to be a very boring summer. Well, this was not so. I mean, after 3 decades, John had become the CEO of the BP Group, had reshaped the profound, and I underline here, profound change in the industry structure, in the structure of the oil industry, especially this top end, which leads in the industry in terms of history and technology, etc., by leading a wave of mergers that made Americans absolutely terrified and followers. So after the BP Amoco merger. So this was for good. The industry today has the shape that it landed after the shake-up that John led through BP. And by the way, he changed the logo to this nice yellow and green thing you have today. However, the importance that John had for the industry goes well beyond his contribution to the big company. For those of you who never saw, still on tape at the internet, in a hot summer day, under this Californian scorching sun, in his other alma mater, by the way, John has a Cambridge degree, but also an MBA at Stanford Business School. He delivered a speech at the time. It was between the Rio conference, the Rio Environment Conference, and the Kyoto Conference, which actually shaped the way the industry looks at social responsibility in terms of carbon emissions to date. And we'll go there beyond. He started the debate. The next day, the paper said, BP left the church. Well, I think John not only left the church, but he created another creed, or at least he made discomforting questions about the future of fossil fuels and global warming, which we still try to answer today. But before I finish, I just want to tell you that he's not only an oil man, he's a multifaceted man. He worked seriously and very successfully promoting the arts, and a philanthropist. I mean, Tate Gallery, I mean, I can go on naming places that he contributed immensely to institutional building and funding, etc. And he fought and still fights a very courageous public defense of minorities against prejudice and discrimination, both in books and in action. And last but not least, John still goes on preaching corporate governance issues and still both practice at the board of many companies and in public and in books. He's been very prolific of the late years, writing about the role of social responsibility and innovation. And that's not by accident, because there are two qualities that are absolutely needed to reduce the extreme reliance that we have on fossil fuels in an economically sensible way. I mean, if I may use some strong words, I mean, he's a bulwark, he's a great talker against the bullshit on energy transition. And why is this important today? That this man that worked in such an uncertain era, in an uncertain industry. I mean, for those of you who are not acquainted with the exploration and production oil and gas industry, these are perhaps the more risky assets in the world. And John is a man that lived in an era that we all lived. It's not exactly an era of certainty, but in an industry which is uncertain. And that's very good, because today, in my view, clearly, the main problem that the industry faces is the uncertainty created by the twin shocks of the rumblings of the OPEC volcano, and which led prices slumping down, and at the same time, the COVID crisis. These two shocks, one shock mainly supply, the other mainly demand, creates an environment of short-term uncertainty, which will be with us for who knows what, who knows, how long. And also it has long-term effects. The COVID crisis effects on public finances go beyond the mist of the short run. And energy transition and subsidies and government subsidies and private subsidies as well, in a way, because research and development are key for that, will be reduced because governments will have less money and companies also. I mean, the debt that the big companies that do the big R&D part has risen enormously. I mean, from 2014, prices falling, and then the crisis. If you look at the debt ratios of the big companies, it's staggering. So I think research and development, both from the public especially, but also from the private net, will be reduced. And that has an impact, certainly impact on energy transition through the diminishing impacts of new technologies. So here's a man that can talk about uncertainty in a time of uncertainty. And my dear John, I think I have set the stage in a somewhat somber way, and I hope you to lead us through the mist. The floor is yours. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Winston. And first, thank you very much for that very generous and kind introduction. And thank you for the invitation to come back to Brazil, although in a virtual form, as we all do every day nowadays. But it's great to be back in Brazil. It's a country where I've done an enormous amount of business, whether it's exploration and production, whether it's investing in biofuels, in sugarcane and in ethanol, whether it is in the chemicals business. And I keep coming back again and again, and it's very good to return. And of course, I've learned a tremendous amount from my friends and colleagues in Brazil about the business and also about the impact of the business on the natural environment and different strata of humanity. I remember having an extraordinary conversation with Israel Klaben in his home, listening to birds sing outside, talking about the possibilities and the threats which arise from development, growth, and what should we do about it in a practical way. So a very important place in my heart and a great one to come back to. You've asked me to talk about two challenges, about the challenges facing the oil industry today. And I always think it's a good idea to start, not so much as many people do, with where does the oil come from, but actually what are we doing with it, what's our demand for it, and how that is changing over time. And over the last 30 years, electrification, the concentration of people in the urban environment, and globalization have underpinned the growing demand for oil. But the advance of science and engineering has reduced the intensity of oil into the economy. And over 30 years, the intensity of oil used for a unit of GDP has been dropping about 1.5% a year every year. And that's come down. So demand for oil is coming down. The rate of increase in demand for oil is coming down and will, I believe, continue to come down. Equally, the demand for coal is coming down, but the demand for natural gas is rising. So against that backdrop, attitudes and behaviors towards hydrocarbons have generally shifted, and the cost of alternative sources of energy has generally fallen. As a result, the proportion of our energy which now comes from low or zero carbon sources has increased, and certainly was expected to reach 25% by 2040, about the same level as oil or gas. Now, in the last 6 months, we've seen maybe years, maybe decades worth of change accelerating. And that's accelerated changes in demand and behavior. Part of it's cyclical, but partly it is the result of changes in preference and in values, which could be permanent. There is still a debate on whether we will work in offices or remotely, and that threatens urbanization. Certainly in Europe, it's threatening the centers of big cities, with unknown consequences too on energy use and energy efficiency. The demand to travel for leisure and for business is coming down, and that calls into question our long-term assumptions about global travel. Consciousness about health has gone up hugely as a result of COVID-19. And I think people are looking around the world and saying, these threats, this very important threat, this almost existential threat in some cases of COVID-19, is something which reminds us about the preciousness of health, but also the force of nature. It's not something that was brought into the world by the action of a president or prime minister or anybody. It came because of nature, and it reminds us that nature is more powerful than anything else that we know of, and reminds us too that if we don't attend to it properly, it can get out of control and do bad things to us. So perhaps it's reminded people that climate change, which is still a subject of debate in spite of the fact of enormous amount of scientific evidence weighing, saying this is a big existential threat to humanity. It reminds us that to let this go uncontrolled may result in consequences that we have no idea how to handle, and be very, very bad for humanity. So I like to think that that's something that the COVID crisis has brought to the fore. So I would expect, therefore, that as a consequence of this, the demand for oil will probably flatten, and supply will be taken care of more and more by state oil companies rather than those in the private sector, because the state companies are there with the best resources and the cheapest resources, and eventually they'll be the people who produce in the very long term the last barrel of oil. So what does it mean for the oil business and the gas business and industry? So I think we've seen various, pick 5 things to talk about. First, I think we've seen in the listed sector of oil and gas big changes in the relative value of the sector. It's shrinking, become almost an irrelevant part of many of the stock exchanges in the world. And therefore, the consequences of an investor not owning oil and gas are very, very small. They used to be very big. It was at one stage 15% of an exchange. If you didn't own it, you made a mistake if the price of oil went up or something happened that made the companies perform better. Now, the consequences are very small, so why should people own it? More importantly, most of the people who own listed equities, of course, have beneficiaries, have people who influence them, and they are increasingly saying to people, we need to have stocks, investments that perform well on so-called ESG ratings, environment, social, and governance ratings. And the investors themselves are saying, it looks as if people who do well in this area tend to do well as an investment. So oil companies are not the most popular because they do not score well on environmental factors, social factors, and sometimes governance factors. So secondly, I think as a result of these pressures, these societal pressures, and the reduction in the importance of oil and gas companies to investors, oil and gas companies themselves are beginning to rethink what it is they're investing in. And I observe that people are tending to look at oil investments, and by that I mean oil production and refining and related matters, as areas that they should begin to think of more as a place to take cash out than to invest in. They will be, if you will, cash cows, and that will change the balance of activity between the listed sector and the state sector. Thirdly, I think, as is inevitable, the demand for energy is changing. It's becoming more based on electricity. Of course, electricity isn't everything. It can't produce the right amount of heat for industrial processes, but it's certainly substituting wherever it can. For example, the beginning of a big impact of electric vehicles in certain parts of the world. Fourthly, I think when there's always been a challenge of getting great people to come into the energy industry, in particular the oil and gas industry. It's not always the case, and in some countries, the oil and gas industry is very popular and people join it. But in the United States, in Europe, I think if people were given a choice, would you like to work in something to do with social media? Would you like to work in software? Or would you like to work in the shale oil business? I think I know where young people tend to vote. And so the challenge, I think, for the oil and gas industry is where to get the talent for the future. And finally, the challenge has been managing oil and gas companies. While the price of oil was high, people overinvested. They overspent, and returns have been terrible. Actually, many people think that oil and gas energy is more profitable than renewable energy, but that wasn't the case during the big oil price boom. Actually, returns were better in renewable energy than they were in oil and gas, and I think investors remember that. So what does this mean? Well, it certainly means that a lot is changing, and I think the changes now are irreversible. People are much more concerned about what is going to happen to the world around them than they have been at any time that I remember. Now, the world does have all the engineered solutions it needs to reduce carbon dioxide and methane emissions to zero. It could do it tomorrow. The problem would be laying out the equipment and the cost, because we do know that tools and techniques that we have not been used enough to either become efficient or lower cost. It's a rule in engineering: the more you do, the cheaper it becomes, and we haven't done a lot of it. So we need to engineer it, we need to make it better. But all the technology, all the science and engineering in the world is not going to solve this problem by itself. We therefore need the counterpart of it, which is public policy. Public policy has to move in line with the voices of the populations to say we are prepared to support these technologies. Put it like this, we either support them or we penalize people who emit CO2, carbon dioxide, or methane into the atmosphere. So a combination of disincentives and incentives is needed in order to promote zero carbon activity. And you can see that beginning in the debate in Europe. Certain parts of the United States are debating this. In fact, it's really open discussion of what to do, what can be done practically to make sure that we get to a point where we are beginning really to reduce carbon emissions down to zero by 2050. What we can't rely on, I think, is multinational, multilateral organizations. There is no global government, there is no global governance that can be enforced in this area. So it's very much big country by big country, small country by small country, trying to do the right thing themselves and coordinating wherever possible in trade blocs in order to get something done. But it's difficult to see one size fitting all around the world. Economies are in different states of development, they have different access to technology, they have different problems to solve. So everybody has to work in their own environment. What I do hope is a combination of ESG pressure by investors, which is to an extent global, the better flow of data and understanding of what is going on, where emissions are, what actually is the cost of renewable energy, and the ability to apply tools and techniques which have been used successfully in one place to another. Those things will make the world move in one direction, I believe. But there are negatives to this. Some people think that the economic setbacks that we've had because of the progressive shutdown of the world as a result of COVID-19 may set back changes, investments in climate change. I hope not. I think that to engineer things for the future, you may as well engineer them correctly, and to do things which reduce carbon emissions and reduce methane emissions rather than increase them, I think is the right and sensible way to go. And I hope that is adopted as an investment philosophy by everybody. But you can't be sure. You can't be sure. But I do hope that we do it in the right way. As a businessman, I have to be an optimist. I've always been an optimist. And I believe that in the end, when we try all sorts of things that don't fit with our purpose, eventually we get back to our purpose. And what is our purpose? Our purpose is really very simple. It's to protect humanity against the consequences of bad behavior with nature. That seems to be a good foundation to build on. And it was the foundation that started in Rio almost 30 years ago. And I think as we go forward from there, we always have to remember where we started. And we started with a very high purpose. I believe we should continue with that purpose. So thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Excellent introduction. You set the stage, very well, very high level, selecting absolutely crucial points and giving us, as I forecasted, through the mist, seeing the things through the mist. And these 5 points are absolutely amazing. And this talk about the changes within the behavior of the companies in the industry and the impact on public listed companies is something that can have an immense effect and some interest to Brazilians as well. So without much delay, I'll send the ball to Décio Oddone, who will intervene now.
Thanks, Winston. It's a pleasure to be here with Lord Browne, Jorge Camargo, and Julia, taking part in this CEBRI webinar. It's difficult to speak after Lord Browne, but I'll try to bring some points to the discussion that we will have afterwards. This event of the largest demand destruction that COVID-19 brought on us, it was a surprise, but on the other hand, we must remember that some indications that the demand was flattening were around already. I remember that EIA in 2019, they issued a report saying that the demand was in the range of 100 million barrels a day, but the demand for gasoline and diesel should weaken by 2025, especially because of the usage of electrical vehicles. And in this report also, EIA said that refiners continue to build much more capacity than needed, especially in China. And we start seeing before the pandemic, we start seeing China gasoline flooding the Asian markets, especially in Singapore, and margins dropped. The same happened in the US. And after COVID, we start seeing a blow to the refining sector, capacity closure, low margins. And what we are seeing now is some ideas of converting refiners to renewable hydrocarbons, biofuels. Phillips 66, Marathon, Holy Frontier is doing that in the US. We also see, especially in Europe, policy support for hydrogen. Hydrogen may substitute petroleum derivatives in road transport, in aviation, in shipping. So now we see refiners trying to adapt to use green hydrogen to decarbonize petroleum products. Shell, BP are companies that are planning investments in this regard. We see Equinor and Phillips as well developing a project in the UK called Hubber. They say this is the first zero carbon industrial hub in the entire world. So things are changing. As Lord Browne said, they are changing very, very fast. And we have the elections in the US. It plays an important role in how things will develop in the near future. We have Trump now try to balance between agriculture and the refining sector, discussing the RFS, the renewable fuel standard, which demands a certain volume of renewable fuels to be mixed with hydrocarbons. And Biden, on the other hand, pro low carbon fuel standards to reduce the carbon intensity. And it's a process that is closer to the European view, which is the Fuel Quality Directive. So if Biden wins the election, it is probably the US will go more towards a direction of net zero emissions by 2050. So yeah, things are changing very, very quickly worldwide, and we here in Brazil must be aware of that. To start the debate, I see two important points for us. First, as Lord Browne mentioned, it looks like that demand is flattening. We may have reached peak demand or not, but demand is flattening, looks like. But we still need hydrocarbons, and we still will need hydrocarbons for the future, for decades to come. And in Brazil, we are devoted to very large projects, long-term projects with needed long investments. And I agree that NOC shall produce the less barrels, but we have a very competitive situation in Brazil, and how this competition for investments can play a role in deciding who will be the one producing the last barrel. That's the first point that I raised for debate. And the second and last one is most related to the downstream operations, which is the balancing between refining and the addition of renewables and usage of hydrogen to decarbonizing the refining sector, and the penetration of the electric vehicles and batteries and hydrogen. So I think those are the 2 points that I bring to the table. Winston, the floor is with you again.
Okay, well, without much ado, I'll ask Jorge to take it.
Thank you, Winston. For me, it's really a pleasure and an honor to be sharing this panel with my old friend Décio, Julia, and Lord Browne, which I fully concur with Winston. He's a person that has been a trendsetter and one of the most influential energy leaders of my generation. So it's a really a great honor for me to discuss. And I have to say, I fully concur with Lord Browne's view of the future of energy, of how the world is reshaping, transition itself towards another world that we are going to live in the going forward. And this is change in terms of supply, of demand, in terms of technology, but also a new geopolitics of energy, I believe, is emerging from this change. And one of the main points I'd like to make today is that I'm convinced that Brazil is quite well placed to be a relevant player in this new global energy order that is unfolding in front of us. And this has been very well described by Lord Browne and also Décio. And I'd like to bring 3 points to justify why I have this positive and this optimistic view on how Brazil is going to fit into the future of energy, basically. The first point, as Lord Browne and Décio emphasized, renewables energy is going to be a very important factor going forward. It has become much more competitive. The cost has become down. So this is something that is one of the main drivers, together, of course, with the decarbonization, is the emergence of renewable energy. And in this space, Brazil has already a long history of being a renewable producer. As you know, our ethanol program is certainly one of the most advanced programs that we have in the world. It has started in the 70s. So Brazil is really a power in terms of ethanol. And now, also solar and wind. We have in Brazil one of the most highest capacity factors in the world. So the main point I want to make is that Brazil has the potential to become a really world champion in terms of renewable energy. So this is one fact that I think it's important to emphasize. The second point, Lord Browne mentioned that demand is going down, that demand for oil is coming down, but gas is coming up, and certain regions of the world, like Asia, is coming up. So we have all this Asia emerging, and that the flux of the energy supplies of the world has changed from west to east. This in itself, I think, is a huge geopolitical change that could justify a panel just to discuss the implication of that, how this is going to play into the China-US confrontation. But anyway, China is the main destination of the oil supplies, and Brazil is already and growing a supplier of energy to Asia. not only to Asia, but not only to China, but China certainly leading the way. Brazil exporting something like 1.5 million barrels a day today, and most of it goes to China. I think we are exporting something like 8 to 10% of China's oil demand. So the point I want to make that Brazil is already a relevant and reliable exporter of energy to Asia. So this together with the renewables, I think makes Brazil an important place in the world, this new world order. And the third point, and that has to do with the core of Lord Browne's fascinating speech. It has to do with how to decarbonize the world. And Brazil starts from a very, very interesting position. We have one of the cleanest energy matrix in the world. We have 40% of Brazil's energy demand is from renewables. In electricity, and that was mentioned, that the world is becoming even more electrified. 83% of the Brazilian electricity needs comes from renewable energy. Just to compare, California was mentioned, and California is one of the states that, as Lord Browne mentioned, that is on the forefront of public policy towards going to zero carbon, and this not now, it's from decades now. California has today 50% of their electricity from renewables, and Brazil has 83%. So if Brazil, in that sense, I think could be called a California dream to become as Brazil it is. So this, I think, the two first points, I think has to do with we can call hard power, our ability to produce renewable energy, our ability to produce oil and gas for the remaining demand. So these are, I think, makes Brazil a kind of energy hard power factors. The third, I think, would be the cleanliness of our energy matrix is what some people describe as soft power. Brazil, in the soft power will be increasingly important in the world forums to discuss the world policy. We don't have a governance, but we have to have coordination, we have to have debates. In Brazil, coming from this clean energy, I think this gives Brazil soft power. And both the Brazilian hard power and the Brazilian soft power has a strong potential to grow going forward. Renewable energy, we're just scratching the Brazilian potential. And with all these funds that is now, global funds that are now directed to renewable energy, I think we have reasons to believe in Brazil that a good part, a large part, an important part of these funds will be direct to Brazil, where we have the exceptional conditions to develop renewable energy technology. So I think it will be a playground for renewable energy going forward, no doubt about that. Oil and gas, we are producing 3 million barrels a day, and we have all the conditions to double this production, thanks to the pre-salt province, and thanks also to the liberalization, the change in the Brazilian regulatory framework, which is very much thanks to this gentleman that is with us today, Décio Oddone, that did a great job when he was the head of the regulatory agency in Brazil. So Brazil is poised to double its production. And the production of the pre-salt is important to mention that, as we all agree, the tendency is to have oil and gas price low for longer, or perhaps low forever. And the pre-salt is still economically robust in the range of $30 to $50 a barrel. So that's another important, let's say, hard power factor that Brazil has in its favor going forward. And also on the soft power, and that's where I think we have lots to improve. So because it's not going to be enough to show to the world that we have a clean energy matrix, we have to do more than that. Our main target in relation to the Paris Conference Agreement is to reduce CO2 by reducing deforestation. That's our main challenge, put that way. And on this aspect, how Brazil preserves the Amazon. Not only how it preserves, how it's perceived to preserve, I think is the key issue. And on that front, I think we have come backwards and we have a lot to improve if you want to, let's say, to use our soft power to be an influencer in the world of energy, in the world of going forward. So that's how I'd like to stop by here. That's the CEBRI views. We see Brazil as an energy and environmental power. These two factors, energy and environmental, is indissocible nowadays. And we really believe that Brazil can become a superpower in terms of energy and environment going forward. It belongs to the future of energy, as was described in a fascinating way by Lord Browne. Thank you, Winston.
Excellent, George, as usual. And listening to your view, or the CEBRI view, as you modestly put it, on Brazil's position in the environmental global discussion and the actions of this government, it reminds me of a beautiful girl that doesn't like to dress well. It's a pity. We're not selling our wares as we should. I mean, it's just a very simple point. Now, a little footnote on coordination from now. I'll send the ball back to Lord Browne to comment on these two very deep and provocative interventions, and then ask him to send me back just to say goodbye and send the ball back to Julia to ask for questions from the general public. So, Lord Browne.
Thank you. So first of all, I thought those were extraordinarily good and apposite interventions. I'd like to start with Brazil. I really do think Brazil is actually the world exemplar of the variety of energy forms that could be produced. I agree, and my experience in biofuels allowed me to travel the country and see the sugarcane fields and some and many parts of the Amazon as well. Incidentally, I also, purely out of great interest, and no one can forget it, went to the Pantanal to see what wildlife really is about. Extraordinary, extraordinary memories of nature and Brazil. But Brazil is a great incubator for renewable energy. Absolutely, I agree, wind and solar efficiencies are very high, and ethanol has a long track record. But also, it is a place where if the reforestation and the use of agricultural land are correctly managed, this is a great place for offsets of carbon in the world. And there are ways of technically doing that now to make sure that it does actually happen through satellite imagery and so forth. And there's real value and money for it. There should be a direct trade-off for farmers to either plant the land or leave it fallow, and there needs to be a rational trade-off presented to them. I think in terms of demand, I think one of the issues with hydrocarbons is we can get into a debate where people look at hydrocarbons and say they're all bad, therefore intrinsically bad, and anything else that produces energy is intrinsically good. This can't possibly be the case. The real question is, how do you handle the hydrocarbons? So natural gas, for example, which is abundant and will be used as the balancing source of electricity, probably along with nuclear. It's bad if you let it escape into the atmosphere. It's good if you really do bottle up the methane to make sure it doesn't go away. And when you burn it, you do something with the carbon dioxide. You bury it, or you use it, you do something with it. My main point is nothing is intrinsically good or bad. It's what you do with it yourself. And I think it's very important in the debate going forward that we make those points and that operators take very seriously what they have to do to manage hydrocarbons in the future. And it is to do with keeping the emissions out. I do think that, and this raises the question of balance in the downstream. Many people think that we should be producing a large amount of free electricity and using it for electrolysis of water to produce hydrogen. I'm sure that's a long-term goal. The medium-term goal is likely to be steam reforming of natural gas. So the question is how best to do that in a way which makes sense. There's no point in doing something that produces more emissions than simply burning the primary source of energy by itself, because hydrogen is, as Décio said, a downstream product. It's a secondary product. It's not a primary energy source. So I think these trade-offs are very important. Electric vehicles powered by a coal-fired power station is not, I think, a very smart thing to do. So it's all about systems. And as we look, I think, forward, we have to take a systems look. It sounds like an engineer speaking, but it's really true. There are trade-offs everywhere. And we really have one mission in mind. The mission is to reduce emissions to zero. We're going to start with net zero, but it better be truly net. In other words, the offsets have to be real, they have to be there, they have to be able to be policed, and we have to make sure we do everything about emissions. It's not about anything else but that. Everything has to form up to that point, and it has to form up to that point in an approach which uses trade-off systems wherever we are. So I think it's really important. I think that point perhaps came through a lot of what was talked about in these two interventions. I think Brazil, being a gigantic country, could actually demonstrate this systems approach in a very, very good way if it set its mind so to do. So let me finish there and send it back to Julia, I think.
Yeah, let me just make a little point here, Lord Browne, to use my powers as a moderator. The moderator is more or less like a constitutional king. He's a little dictator at times. He can be, if he uses it well, even a loved king. So I'll ask you one more question before we send the ball to Julia, and then we can send that directly after you finish your question, your answer. You raised your 5 points, actually go down to 2 if you organize them in the way I did. One are governance issues. And this is, they've been there, it's just a caveat. You basically say that, look, guys, this is a risk industry. This is not a home run. This industry has this myth that the worst thing in the world is a bad managed refinery, or the best thing in the world is a bad managed refinery. It's an industry where profits came out as from the sky. This is a big lie. It's an industry that's deceived by the fact that high prices and high generates fights for resources which are more expensive and have dynamic effects which can be very damaging. We're seeing it right now. So it's dynamically, it's very complicated. Has always been, has operational risks and financial risks. Okay, now, this is interesting. Now, because of several shocks, and we've been accustomed to live like people that live by a volcano with the rumblings. I mean, OPEC is like that. It's like the Ex-ANP in Sicily. I mean, we live with that. I mean, sometimes they go bad, they go mad, and then we pick the debris and go on. Now, this is becoming more and more complicated. But the second point you raise is a governance issue, or a bunch of governance issues. And this is new. What you said here is that this crisis is different because it raised the problem of oil as a health industry for you. It's not a kind of global warming thing. So you just go a little north or wherever, even it's horrible because it may be flooded, but it's not like we are feeling now. I mean, we feel what a global health crisis is. This is different. This has governance implications. And what you said about listed companies, and capital budgeting and financing, listed companies, governance issues. I mean, and especially vis-a-vis in a process which is a trend. I mean, you didn't show that there's something new. You said there's just acceleration of trends that people in the church, as usually church people do, were not addressing. This is the key thing you brought to us here. There were trends that were amplified now and have to be dealt with without global governance. And that's the hell of it. So and just to finish, you said also that NOCs would be, the national oil companies would be the great, the winners. Now this is a mixed bunch. You have a lot of, basically if you list them by resources and governance, I mean, you are all over the place. So, I mean, who will be the winners? And that's the $600 million question. And then you may send the ball straight to Julia afterwards. Sorry about that, sir.
I can't predict who will be the winner. What I do know is that, like every commodity, cost matters. So oil and gas companies who are state-owned have to worry about their cost base. They have to worry about their reputation, I think, as capable of borrowing money on the international markets. So that's where ESG does meet the state oil companies as well as the private sector. So they have to do their thing here. If I may, I think one of the problems that the oil and gas industry I've observed has is for so many years, it didn't listen to anybody. It didn't listen to its customers. It didn't listen to the generations coming up, and it did its own thing. It simply said, we're in the business of producing oil and gas and maximizing profits. There's always a cost to that. And the cost comes in different ways. It comes from people saying, I don't want to invest in you, to saying, actually, I want to ban you, or I want to think of your products as very bad for my health, and therefore I don't want them. So I think, the oil industry is making up for lost time now, and let's see how far it can go. But I repeat again, it has to remember that all today's activities start from a purpose, which is to make sure we don't damage humanity by damaging the earth. And that, I think, that's the path we're on. It's what we started with in 92, probably what we started before 92 in Rio. And we have to remember, as we go forward on the path, we have to remember where we started. And very important.
Thank you very much. Julia, can take the ball.
Okay, thank you, Winston. So we'll start a question from Valeria Rossi from ExxonMobil, who's also a member of CEBRI. Her question is complementary of Jorge Camargo's question and comments. As we see the acceleration of trends in the demand for oil, you describe a possible flattening on the demand. What role do you see for Brazil, especially in the oil exploration? And are we at risk of leaving our great potential and resources untapped underground?
Well, I think so thank you for that question. I think, as we said, it is a very competitive business, and there are some great companies competing, probably for a smaller amount of demand. So the competition will be on cost, security, how secure are you? Can you fulfill commitments? And on your commitments to environmental, social, and governance matters, because I think that will direct the way in which debt can be procured from the international markets. That's really very important indeed. Even if you're 100% state-owned, chances are you have to borrow money, and that money has to come from somewhere. So I think, Brazil has a great track record. It needs to build it with clarity for the future and be very consistent, very, very consistent, because inconsistency allows people to take their eye off one place and go somewhere else. So I think those are important things, and I'm sure that, the reality is Brazil will do very well. if it behaves in that way and is very professional in the approaches it takes.
Okay, thank you. So a question now from Tomás Zanotto from the Brazilian industry of São Paulo, Fiesp. If you could comment on the two European Union initiatives, the Carbon Adjustment Mechanism, the CBAM, and the Energy Tax the Directive, ATD, and their implications on foreign trade.
So I think this is all about, this is actually about adjusting for no global governance. So if you expect that your own industries should be a zero carbon, how can you import things from places which are not zero carbon without penalizing them in some way? Otherwise, you disadvantage your industries against imported goods and services. So it's an adjustment, if you will, for not having a global agreement. So that, I think, is something that is a big debate about whether Europe is prepared to pay for this, much as it's paid for a change in the social structure. The cost of employment in Europe is high because Europe has decided that that's the way it should be. People should have rights and they have to be paid for. So these are just another form of rights, the rights for health and clean air and the rights for reducing CO2 and methane emissions. So the debate's there. It changes a lot of things in the trade relationships of Europe, but it's simply another form of tariff. And I think nowadays we're all used to seeing tariffs coming in and out, coming in and out everywhere. I think eventually when everybody does it, of course, the tariffs go to zero. That's when people agree to do the same thing everywhere. That's a long way off.
Thank you. So now I have questions to all panelists from Armando Henriquez. His question is, what are the views of the panelists regarding the new cycles of oil in the next 30 years? And if you can see them happening, how would they affect the Brazilian pre-salt exploration and the development in the near future?
Now, Julia should be the constitutional queen. And if I suggest, I'll ask you to ask Décio for that.
Décio.
I remember when I was about to join the agency at the end of 2016, the discussions were on the break-even of the pre-salt reserves. Some said that, used to say that it was in the range of $45, $50 a barrel. And then we start seeing those numbers shrinking and shrinking very, very fast. Now we hear numbers in the range of $20 to $25 a barrel for the most productive fields. And the lifting costs for the most efficient ones, I have heard numbers in the range of $3 a barrel. This is really unbelievable. Those are numbers equivalent to the ones we see in the Middle East. So I think that the potential for the pre-salt is there. The issues I raise on these regards first is that those projects are very long-term projects, and it takes a long time for the first oil to come and to pay for the very heavy investment. So I think companies they must work in order to expedite those timings, and the government must help with a better licensing process, and also the question of the competitiveness. If we have, as we have in Brazil, a very regressive tax system, it's something that affects companies' investment decisions. But as Jorge said, and Lord Browne said as well, we have here a national company. It's a public company. It has a good governance. And I believe that the combination between Petrobras as our flagship and the international investor will take care of the pre-salt development.
Very good, Julia. Does anyone want to dip on the question, or shall we move on? It's okay, Julia, move on.
Let's move. So a question for Lord Browne from Ieda Gomes. As the IOC transition to IEC, which is International Oil Company, to Integrated Energy Company, do you think they are well equipped in terms of talent, business model, to compete to a low carbon arena if the IOCs invested heavily in unsuccessful and alternative energy back in 2006? What will be different now?
So it is, of course, an open question and one which is debated a lot. IOCs have, with the downstream, have access to a lot of customers. The first question is, do they really know them? And what can they provide them, which is different than oil products? So that is the big question. You know, can they provide, for example, electric charging for electric vehicles? Can they provide synthetic biofuels for aviation or for other forms of transportation? Can they provide electricity for the grid? And do they understand how to do it? I'm absolutely sure that since these are engineering-based companies, that they have the engineering skills to do this. They have the engineering skills and they have the project skills to do things like this. The question is, do they have the commercial skills and the commercial understanding that many competitors have that have been in the business of providing electricity and other things to consumers? Clearly, there are some very powerful companies who are changing. They're beginning to change their investment patterns. It's not as if they aren't oil and gas companies. They still are dominantly based on oil and gas as their sources of cash flow. So they're testing the margin. And I think we will only know after several years of success whether this is working. And they're certainly going to try, that I can see from many of the companies.
Thank you.
Can I make a little question using again my...
Yes, please.
That's a very, very little input to Lord Browne. You mentioned that implicitly the cost of equity for the quoted company is going to rise. I mean, they're going down in the favor of investors, okay? So this has implications for investment costs, renewal of reserves, and even for facing a flat demand. And if you have the time, can you comment on that? This is, I think, a real threat.
It is indeed. And so an access to further equity is probably heavily limited, if not cut off. So the cash that's being used is often a trade-off between returns to shareholders, direct returns to shareholders, or reinvestment. And I think you can see this debate taking place everywhere. What is the right level of dividend? How much money is to be allocated to the different sectors that they're in, whether it's oil and gas, or whether it's oil only, gas only, refining. Where does this money go? And can they make space with internally generated funds to find the equity to put behind new forms of energy? So that's a question. Most of them have sufficient assets and cash flow to access the debt markets at, certainly in today's environment, with a wall of money everywhere at very low cost. And people are doing things like issuing hybrid debt at, which could be regarded as half equity and half debt for costs which are remarkably low for today. So I think it's a particular consequence of quantitative easing, but nonetheless, they have access to the debt market, maybe not to the equity market.
Excellent. Julia.
Okay, a general question here from Frederico Brito. What should be the role of the state in the immediate aftershock?
That's a very big question. And I think one which I'm going to have to cut down to size. I think I would say that if you look around the world is a gigantic macroeconomic laboratory. Everybody is doing something, and many of them are doing slightly different things. So we don't know which of the fit-for-purpose policies is working. But there is no doubt that everyone has concluded that the loosening of money supply, the role of the state in stopping the worst ravages of an economic downturn is there. Actually, in the energy business, it's carrying on. It has its own macro problem, because while all this was happening, of course, demand went down, energy prices went down. The oil and gas companies had general assistance from the state, in some cases, the ability to delay the redundancies that were very necessary to reduce costs through furlough schemes and so forth. But actually, they found themselves having to look after themselves. Self-help was something that they all did. But let's see what happens. I mean, I do think the world needs to create a higher degree of confidence in order to really make all these instruments work. The same is true with the oil industry and the gas industry and the energy industry. And that confidence can only come from people believing that they're not at threat when they get together with lots of people. Maybe that takes better therapies for COVID-19 and better and hopefully vaccines that will protect people, albeit even for a limited period of time.
So Winston, we have 5 minutes. I'd like to know if you want to do a wrap up and last comments from you and Jorge and Décio.
That's up. Décio, Jorge, you want to come back?
Or last comments?
Well, yes. I mean, it's free.
Yeah, I will pick up on something that Lord Browne said. It really was a pleasure to be here with him, an inspiration for all of us. Again, with George, an old friend, colleague, and boss, an inspiration as well, Winston and Julia. But Lord Browne said that no source of energy is intrinsically bad. And that's absolutely correct. I remember that oil was a solution in the past. Oil and gas made the modern world possible. We are connecting here because we have oil and gas. In the beginning of the 19th century, a person needed to work 6 to 8 hours to acquire a candle to have light for 1 hour at home. Then we had the oil industry, the first well in Pennsylvania, and then kerosene. And by 1870s, only 15 minutes were needed to work in order to have 1 hour of light. Nowadays, a fraction of a second, a labor must work in order to have 1 hour of light at home. That's amazing, and we forget about that. The whales, the sperm whale was about to be extinct in last century because of the usage of whale oil for lightning. We have horses all over the place, thousands, 300,000 horses in London, in New York, thousands of horses dying every day, every month, every year in those metropolis, and thousands of people dying of manure and flies, diseases related. So we cannot forget all these advances. We still have billions, more than 1 billion people in the world using biomass to cook. We still have more than 1 million people dying every year because of disease caused by the usage of biomass to cook. And then we start talking about renewal. That's excellent. We must go for that. But remember, the biggest revolution we have seen lately in the energy industry was the shale revolution in the US. So there is a lot of progress in front of us that we have to do in order to really get the net zero emissions. It's something that our generation must lead, must continue doing, and must leave for the next generations. And using Lord Browne's words again, and this transition will be an integration of all these energy sources. Every generation has its own challenges, and the biggest challenge of our generation is to provide cheap, affordable, and clean energy to those billions of people in especially in the poor countries. And in order to do that, it will be through integrating through systems, as Lord Browne said. But I believe that we are in the right path, and this COVID situation raised the awareness of a lot of people worldwide, and I think that we'll do that. It was really a pleasure participating in this debate.
Thank you so much, Décio.
Sorry, Jorge, you want to say something before we send the ball to Lord Browne back to say goodbye?
Yes, Winston, I just want to say that I really enjoyed participating in this debate, in this panel. It was a pleasure, and I could stay here for hours, listen to all of you. It was really fantastic. And I agree. Lord Browne's mentioned one of these 5 points, challenges, was how to attract people, young people, how to attract talent. No? That's I fully agree. But I agree with Décio. We have in this industry, the energy industry, the most challenging problem or challenge of our time. We have, as Décio said, we have to provide energy, increasing amount of energy to billions of people that still are excluded from the prosperity, from the life that energy provides. And at the same time, we have to reduce the carbon that we emit. So how to achieve these 2 challenges, the 2 targets, is probably one of the most challenging problems of humanity ever. Né? So to be part of it and to help to solve this, we should be able to attract good people, to try to help to attract these people to face the challenge of the future generation. So I have a very positive view. I think that going forward to be in this industry will be even more interesting, and we should do better to communicate this to young people, to young talents, so that we can attract them to work for us. So thank you very much. It was really a pleasure and an honor to be participating in this panel.
Great, Jorge. Thank you so much. So, Lord Browne, for your last comments.
So first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be on a panel with 2 very distinguished Brazilians who've done so much for the energy industry, and also to be moderated by a very distinguished Brazilian and a friend of mine, Winston Fritsch. I want to finish on an optimistic note, and I want to take Décio's point about light. The pricing of a unit of light is one of the longest run things that we can get out of history. And in the year 1300, in today's money, 1 lumen cost approximately $40,000. Today, the cost is 0. Almost 0. So this says something about what happens with development, progress, engineering, and science. It's not going to stop. What we see in the past will be repeated again and again. It won't be the same, as Mark Twain says, history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. So I'm a great optimist for the future. I really do think we will solve these problems. All we have to do is get out of our own way. And we need to do the right thing. We need to remember our purpose. Remember our purpose. We get out of our own way, we will succeed. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you in Brazil. I hope very soon I will be there physically in person.
I'll take you on that. I'll put you on that. Thank you very much. Julia, finish.
Okay, so thank you so much, Lord Browne, to be here with us. As we said, it's really a great honor. We really hope you can come physically and participate in a debate at our headquarters at CEBRI. And I'd like to thank so much for our super specialists in energy from CEBRI, so Jorge, Décio, and Winston, to participate in this debate today. And of the audience here, that we had almost 300 people on YouTube and Zoom. So thank you so much for being here with us, and till the next debate. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.